Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today I'll be doing a video on the topic of open files. So for this first video, what I wanted to focus on is the various ways and motives in which you can take control over an open file. And then in future videos, I'll be focusing a bit more about how to actually exploit the advantage of controlling the open file. But for this first video, what I want to show you guys is some of the most common ways that you can take control over an open file. Some, let's say, special tricks you can do with your pieces in order to really seize control over an open file, which will then give you a nice strategic advantage. Now we know that in general, open files are often used for attacks against the enemy king. If you have an open file leading up, let's say, on the G file or the H file against the enemy king, this can be a very dynamic weapon, and you can use this to launch a winning attack. But in a lot of cases, especially when the open file is in the center or on the queen side, this is more of a strategic tool. You can use an open file to bring your pieces and infiltrate into your opponent's position, which will then give your pieces a lot of activity, and from there you can try to seek some kind of material gain, like winning a pawn or two, which will then give you good chances of winning the game from there. So in this first example here, we don't yet have any open files, but as you can see in the center, there is some tension as the D and C pawns are currently threatening to capture one another. Now, if white wanted to, they could take on C5 right away, and after black takes with the D pawn, we would have the open D file. But before capturing, white does something very, very smart, and he plays the move rook ad1. So rather than opening the file right away, he first places his rook on the D file, and we'll see white actually double his rooks on the D file before capturing on C5. This is very important because here white kind of has the space advantage, so he has the room for his pieces to double on the D file, while black won't really be able to do the same thing with their rooks. Note that if black chooses to take on D4 themselves, white takes back with the rook, and as you can see, the D6 pawn will be a crucial weakness. White can then double his heavy pieces on the D file and will most likely win the pawn. So black is kind of stuck. He played rook ad8, so he's preparing his rook for the opening of the file, and rook d2. b6, rook d1, bishop c6, and now white is ready to finally take on c5 and open the file. Now black has to take with the d pawn because the pawn on d6 is currently hanging, and white would be simply a pawn up. So black takes with the d pawn. And now it seems like, okay, white has two rooks on the d file, but black's rook on d8 is sufficiently protected. So it would be a mistake for white to simply exchange all the rooks, as white would then be giving up his advantage completely, and actually it will be black that gets control over the open d file. So instead, white plays a fantastic move here, knight to d6. And this is one of the other ideas I'll be talking about in this video, how you can place one of your minor pieces in the way of your rooks, let's say, but on a very strong square, where if the piece is well supported, it'll be controlling a lot of squares in black's camp and giving white this big strategic advantage. Now if white just had a pawn on e5, of course we would say that the square on d6 is an outpost, since the knight is basically untouchable. But white does not have such a pawn, instead will have to rely on the power of his rooks. So let's see how white converted his advantage from here. Black traded bishops, played knight b4, and here white plays knight b5. Interesting move, attacking the queen on c7. Black gave a check, and here white defended against the check with the move f3. Now this was a decent move, but in fact the move queen f3 would also have been very strong. And the point is that after black exchanges the queens, black is forced to give up control over the d file since the rook on d8 is currently hanging. Black would have to take on d2, and white recaptures. Now both sides can take the a pawn with their knight, but in this resulting endgame, white is going to have a clear advantage thanks to the activity of his rook. From here the rook can go to either b7 or d6, and the king is also closer to the center, which gives white a really big advantage here. In the game, white played f3, which is not as strong but still holds on to the advantage. Now black's rook on d8 is again hanging, so black had to take on d2. And here, very nice moment, queen takes d2. This is another idea I would like to focus on. Instead of recapturing with the rook, which may seem natural to a lot of players, queen takes d2 is a lot stronger. Now white has two heavy pieces on the d file and can infiltrate with queen d7 next move. So black played a6, kicking the knight. Knight went back, knight c6, and finally queen d7. Now black is basically obliged to trade queens, and white gets this endgame that we discussed before, where he has a huge advantage thanks to the activity of his rook. So from here, white was able to convert his advantage fairly easily, and if you're interested in how the game continued, I would suggest checking out the PGN after you're done with this lesson. But for now, we'll move on to the next game. But I would strongly encourage you guys to check out the PGN so you can see exactly how white was able to convert his advantage from here. So for our next example, we see that the d file has already been open, and both sides have connected their rooks, which means it seems like both sides have equal control over the d file. But white's next move gives white the advantage, and this is definitely an idea I want you guys to retain. He played the move bishop a5. Very strong move, and the point is that the bishop on a5 is actually an annoying thorn in black's position. This bishop is, of course, attacking the rook on d8, and because of this, black is going to be forced to give up control over the d file. If black plays a move like rook d7, for example, white can exchange rooks, and thanks to his queen controlling the d1 square, white can play rook d1 and regain control over the open file. So this was pretty similar to what happened in the game. In the game, black simply traded on d1, white takes back, and played bishop e7. So the first part is complete. White has gained control over the d file, but given the chance, black might want to play a move like queen e8 and then bishop d8 and start fighting back against white's pieces. So even though white has a nice static advantage here, it's possible that he might not be able to control the d file for very long. So white has to continue with energetic play. And this next move is another idea I would love to focus on in this video. Very, very strong move that I think might look a bit strange to some viewers, but it's the move queen to f3. Really, really fantastic move. So the point here is that white is challenging black's queen on c6, and if we're able to exchange queens, white's rook will gain access to the square on d7, and once again white will have this very nice endgame where his rook is so active that it gives white almost a decisive advantage. Note that the queen on f3 is also hitting the f7 pawn, so black's hand is really forced here. If black plays a move like queen e8 to defend the pawn, then white can seize full control over the d file with queen d3 check. King has to move, queen d7, and white has a huge positional advantage. Black also had the choice to exchange queens here on f3, and I think this is what would kind of perturb a few players who might not want to see their pawns doubled on the king side. But a really important concept of evaluation is understanding which features of the position outweigh one another. Here white's pawns look ugly, but they are not such a big deal in the position, especially when our rook is going to be able to access d7 and be able to target all of black's pawns, especially black's a6 pawn and black's f7 pawn and the c5 pawn are all potentially weaknesses, whereas white's pawns on f2 and f3 are easily guarded by the king. So these double pawns here really don't affect the position very much. Much more important is the fact that our rook is able to control the open file and is going to activate itself very soon. So I really love this move queen f3 because it shows a very deep understanding of the idea of the power of controlling an open file. In the game, black played king g8. This move is pretty sensible. Black is anticipating the exchange of queens and tries to bring his king closer to the center for the endgame. Now white played the move rook b7, and eventually white is actually going to play rook b6 and force the exchange of rooks, which will give white a winning bishop endgame. But of course he's not going to do this until he's fully ready for the exchange. So the game continued like so, f6. And white brought his king in. and finally played this move g4, which is a very nice positional idea in order to fix all of black's pawns on dark squares, which gives white a very nice path for the king to come in and go after black's pawns in the endgame. Rook b6 was played, king d3, king f7, king e4, king e6, f3, rook c6, rook b7, bishop f8, and now white forced the exchange of rooks with bishop a5, bishop e7, and rook to b6. Now for analysis on why this exchange was winning, once again please check out the PGN file where I've included some variations as to why white has a winning endgame after the exchange of rooks. In fact, in the original game, black resigned in this position, seeing that the endgame was going to be lost. So it'll be quite instructive for you guys to check out exactly how white will be able to convert the advantage. But for this video, we'll now move on to the next example. So for our next example, here we have an open C file on the board, and white's rook is already well placed controlling this file, but clearly we can see that black is ready to play rook c8 very soon in order to challenge white's control over the open file. So here white finds a very nice idea in bishop a6. And the point of this move is that white is going to be able to exchange a key defender of black's position. Now this move might be surprising to some of you. If we go back a move, if we look at the two bishops here, we can easily say that in this position, white has a good bishop and black has a bad bishop due to the pawn structure and the fact that white's bishop has more activity. But sometimes it's very important to understand that just because a bishop is bad doesn't mean it's not important to the defense of black's position. Here white understands this, and by exchanging the bishops, white is given access to the light squares in black's position. Specifically, the squares c6 and c8 will be very useful for white in order to try and penetrate black's position and then win the game. So if black captures on a6, white is able to come in with the queen, and now as you can see, white has a number of threats here. First is to simply take the a7 pawn, and second is to come in with the rook with rook c6. If white's heavy pieces are able to infiltrate black's position, it will most likely be decisive, especially since this powerful knight on e5 is basically controlling the entire board, at least from black's point of view. So in the game, black played the move queen to b8, white traded bishops, queen takes b7, and now a very natural and strong move, queen c2. So white again puts his queen and rook on the open file, and now white is ready to infiltrate with queen c7, get his rook in, and win the game. So black fights back, he plays rook e8, queen c7, and rook e7. So a good defensive idea, black is not giving up the 7th rank. And instead of changing queens, white chooses just to play queen to d6 to keep his pieces extremely active. Black can't really do anything but sit and wait. White improves his position with h3. And black is giving up the 7th rank with this next move, rook e8. The problem for black is if he makes another move, for example, knight to e4 looks natural, white will play queen d8. And with the rook coming to c8 soon, black's king is going to end up in serious trouble. So rook e8 was played. This gives white the 7th rank. Queen a6. And now white had a number of ways to win here. In fact, the sacrifice rook takes g7 was already a decisive blow. After black captures the rook, white comes in with the queen, and thanks to this key move queen f7, black is going to have to give back a lot of material, and white will be winning here. But this whole combination was not really necessary. Grandmaster Lev Polygaevsky, a famous Russian grandmaster from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he found a simpler way to win here, and he simply exchanged knights. Knight d7 was played, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and now white's queen and rook are so active that this is simply a decisive advantage. Black had to play rook g8, and white was able to start collecting pawns. And after the move g4, the game did not last much longer. White is starting to simply play queen g6, push his pawn to g5, and open up black's king to basically decisive effect. So I really like this example and included it in the video, mainly because of this idea to play bishop a6 in order to exchange the key defender of black's position. I think this idea would not be obvious to a lot of players, especially when they see that, okay, we have a good bishop on d3, we don't necessarily want to exchange it, but here control and dominance over the c-file was ultimately the deciding factor. Our last game here is quite a famous example, but I wanted to include it just for completeness sake and to show you guys another very fundamental idea of fighting for control over an open file. So this is the game Karpov vs. Unziker. This was played in the Olympiad in 1974. And as you can see, there is an open A file on the board and both sides have their rooks connected and seemingly they have equal control over this file. But the way Karpov ends up seizing control over the A file is quite excellent and got this example to be featured in many books and videos and is ultimately a truly positional masterpiece. So he starts with the move rook a2. And the idea of this move is very simple. He wants to double the rooks on the A file. And now black played c4. And now white has a question of where to put the bishop. In the game, white played bishop b1 with the obvious drawback that this blocks the rook from e1 to go to a1. But the reason Karpov did this is, of course, he already has a very nice idea in mind. But if he put the bishop on f1, which would keep the rooks connected, the bishop here would be less optimal. White really wants to keep the bishop on the b1, h7 diagonal for future play, because a lot of times white ends up switching to the king side and really needs this bishop on this diagonal. But after the move bishop b1, black played queen d8. And now it's not clear what white is going to do because black is starting to capture on a2, white will have to recapture, and black will take control over the A file by bringing the other rook to a8. But here comes Karpov's idea, and some of you may have seen this game as it is pretty much very famous. Bishop a7. A really fantastic move. The point is that white places his bishop on a7 and basically freezes black's rook on a8. He also freezes the other rook by controlling the b8 square. And by keeping this bishop on a7, this allows white to then build up on the A file, mainly by connecting the rooks, and then at a certain moment he can retreat the bishop and you'll have all of his heavy pieces on the A file and white will be able to take control over that file. So the game continued knight e8, bishop c2, knight c7, rook a1, queen e7, and bishop b1. Basically this bishop on a7 is just freezing black's entire position, and now white can take his time and improve his position before choosing when exactly to open things up. I mean, this is a very, very large advantage both in a strategic sense and psychological sense. It is very satisfying to be the one who's in full control over the position. So black played bishop e8, he is just shuffling, knight d8, knight h2, bishop g7, and f4. Now that white has full control over the A file, he switches to the king side and starts his king side play with this move f4. Not only does white control the A file, he also has more space in the center, and this gives him the freedom to basically choose which side of the board he wants to play on and allows his pieces to be able to move very freely. Now if you'd like to see the rest of this game, I would strongly recommend you guys do check out the PGN of the entire game, which will be included for you outside of this video. And you'll be able to see how exactly Karpov was able to convert his strategic advantage from here. For now, this basically wraps up our first video on the topic of open files. I hope I gave you guys a couple of nice ideas about how exactly you should be able to fight for the open file. Until next time, this was International Master Kostya Kavutskiy. Take care.